We start Pompey from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. The people of Rome seem to have entertained for Pompey from his childhood the same affection that Prometheus in the tragedy of Aeschylus expresses for Hercules, speaking of him as the author of his deliverance in these words: "Ah, cruel sire, how dear thy son to me, the generous offspring of my enemy." For on one hand, never did the Romans give such demonstrations of a vehement and a fierce hatred against any of their generals as they did against Strabo, the father of Pompey, during whose lifetime, it is true, they stood in awe of his military power, as indeed he was a formidable warrior, and immediately upon his death, which happened by a stroke of thunder, they treated him with the utmost contumely, dragging his corpse from the bier as was carried to his funeral. On the other side, never had any Roman the people's goodwill and devotion more zealous throughout all the changes of fortune, more early in its first springing up, or more steadily rising with his prosperity, are more constant in his adversity than Pompey had. In Strabo there was one great cause of their hatred, his insatiable covetousness. In Pompey there were many that helped to make him the object of their love: his temperance, his skill, his exercise in war, his eloquence of speech, integrity of mind, and affability in conversation and address, insomuch that no man ever asked a favor with less offense, or conferred one with a better grace. When he gave it was without assumption; when he received it was with dignity and honor. In his youth his countenance pleaded for him, seeming to anticipate his eloquence; and when upon the affections of the people, before he spoke, his beauty, even in his bloom of youth, had something in it at once of gentleness and dignity; and when his prime of manhood came, the majesty and kingliness of his character at once became visible in it. His hair sat somewhat hollow, or rising a little, and this, with the languishing motion of his eyes, seemed to form a resemblance in his face, though perhaps more talkative than really apparent, to the statues of the King Alexander, and because many applied that name to him in his youth, Pompey himself did not decline it, insomuch that some called him so in derision, and Lucius Philippus, a man of consular dignity, when he was pleading in favor of him, thought it not unfit to say that people could not be surprised if Philip was a lover of Alexander. It is related of Flora, the courtesan, that when she was now pretty old, she took great delight in speaking of her early familiarity with Pompey, and was wont to say that she could never part after being with him without a bite. She would further tell that Gymnias, a companion of Pompey's, fell in love with her, and made his court with great importunity, and on her refusing, telling him, however, her inclinations were, yet she could not gratify his desires for Pompey's sake. He therefore made his request to Pompey, and Pompey frankly gave his consent, but never afterwards would have any converse with her, notwithstanding that he seemed to have a great passion for her, and Flora, on this occasion, showed none of the levity that might have been expected of her, but languished for some time after under a sickness brought on by grief and desire. Well, when you think it might be your friend's girl, it's, as they say, it's good to check, right? Of course, there's some issues with different parts of that phrase, but this Flora, we are told, was such a celebrated beauty that Cacilius Metellus, when he adorned the temple of Castor and Pollux with paintings and statues, among the rest dedicated hers for her singular beauty, and his conduct also to the wife of Demetrius, his freed servant, who had great influence with him in his lifetime, and left an estate of 4,000 talents. Pompey acted contrary to his usual habits, not quite fairly or generously, fearing lest he should fall under common censure of being enamored and charmed with her beauty, which was irresistible, and became famous everywhere. Nevertheless, though he seemed to be so extremely circumspect and cautious, yet even in matters of this nature he could not avoid the calumnies of his enemies. But upon the score of married women, they accused him as if he had connived at many things, and embezzled the public revenue to gratify their luxury. Of his easiness and temper and plainness in what related to eating and drinking, the story is told that once, in a sickness, when his stomach nauseated common meats, his physician prescribed him a thrush to eat. But upon search, there was none to be bought, for they were not then in season, and one telling him they were to be had at Lucullus's, who kept them all the year round. So then, said he, if it were not for Lucullus's luxury, Pompey should not live, and thereupon, not minding the prescription of the physician, he contented himself with such meat as could easily be procured. But this was at a latter time, being as yet a very young man, and upon an expedition in which his father was commanding against Cinna. He had in his tent with him one Lucius Terentius as his companion and comrade, who, being corrupted by Cinna, entered into an engagement to kill Pompey, as others had done to set the general's tent on fire. This conspiracy being discovered to Pompey at supper, he showed no discomposure at it, but on the contrary drank more liberally than usual, and expressed great kindness to Terentius. But about bedtime, pretending to go to his repose, he stole away secretly out of the tent, and setting a guard about his father, quietly expected the event. Terentius, when he thought the proper time come, rose with his naked sword, and coming to Pompey's bedside, stabbed several strokes through the bedclothes, as if he were lying there. Immediately after this, there was a great uproar throughout all the camp, arising from the hatred they bore to the general, and an universal movement of the soldiers to revolt, all tearing down their tents, and betaking themselves to their arms. The general himself all the while durst not venture out, because of the tumult, but Pompey, going about in the midst of them, besought them with tears, and at last threw himself prostrate upon his face before the gate of the camp, and lay there in the passage at their feet, shedding tears, and bidding those that were marching off, if they would go, trample upon him, upon which none could help going back again, and all except 800, either through shame or compassion, repented, and were reconciled to the general. Well, if they hadn't, obviously, they could have formed a search party and probably got him. Immediately upon the death of Strabo, there was an action commenced against Pompey as his heir, for that his father had embezzled the public treasure, but Pompey, having traced the principal thefts, charged them upon one Alexander, a freed slave of his father's, and proved before the judges that he had been the appropriator. But he himself was accused of having in his possession some hunting tackle and books that were taken at Asculum. To this he confessed thus far, that he received them from his father when he took Asculum, but pleaded further that he had lost them since. But Cinna's return to Rome, when his house was broken upon and plundered by Cinna's guards. In this case he had a great many preparatory pleadings against his accuser, in which he showed in activity and steadfastness beyond his years, and gained great reputation, and took favor, insomuch that Antistius, the praetor and judge of the case, took a great liking to him and offered him his daughter in marriage. Having had some communications with his friends about it, Pompey accepted the proposal, and they were privately contracted. However, the secret was not so closely kept as to escape the multitude, but it was discernible enough from the favor shown him by Antistius in his cause, and at last, when Antistius pronounced the absolutory sentence of the judges, the people, as if it had been upon a single given, made the acclamation used according to the ancient custom at marriages. Tellatio, the origin of which custom is related to be this: at the time when the daughters of the Sabines came to Rome to see the shows and sports there, and were violently seized upon by the most distinguished and bravest of the Romans for wives, it happened that some goat swains and herdsmen of the manor rank were carrying off a beautiful and tall maiden, and lest any of their betters should meet them and take her away, as they ran, they cried out with one voice, Tellatio, Tellatius, being a well-known and a popular person among them, insomuch that all that they heard the name clapped their hands for joy, and joined with them in the shout, as applauding and congratulating the chance. Now say they, because of this proved a fortunate match to Tellatius, hence it is that this acclamation is sportively used as a nuptial cry of all weddings. This is the most credible of the accounts that are given of the Tellatio, and some few days after this judgment Pompey married Antistia. Okay, I missed what it meant. I know it's saying it's the guy's name. After this, he went to Cinna's camp, where, finding some false suggestions and calumnies prevailed against him, he began to be afraid, and presently withdrew himself secretly, which sudden disappearance had occasioned great suspicion, and there went a rumor and speech throughout all the camp that Cinna had murdered the young man, upon which all that had been anyways disobliged and bore any malice to him resolved to make an assault upon him. He, endeavoring to make his escape, was seized by a centurion, who pursued him with his naked sword. Cinna, in this distress, fell upon his knees and offered him his seal ring of great value for his ransom, but the centurion repulsed him insolently, saying, I did not come to seal a covenant, but to be revenged upon a lawless and wicked tyrant, and so dispatched him immediately. Thus Cinna being slain, Carbo, a tyrant, yet more senseless than he, took the command and exercised it, while Sulla meantime was approaching, much to the joy and satisfaction of most people, who in their present evils were ready to find some comfort, if it were but in the exchange of a master, for the city was brought to that pass by oppression and calamities, that, being utterly in despair of liberty, men were only anxious for the mildest and most tolerable bondage. At that time Pompey was in Picenum in Italy, where he spent some time amusing himself, as he had estates in the country there, though the chief motive of his stay was the liking he felt for the towns of that district, which all regarded him with hereditary feelings of kindness and attachment. But when he now saw that the noblest and best of the city began to forsake their homes and property, and fly from all quarters into Sulla's camp, as to their haven, he likewise was desirous to go, not, however, as a fugitive alone, and with nothing to offer, but as a friend rather than a suppliant, in a way that would gain to offer, but as a friend rather than in a way that would gain him honor, bringing help along with him, and at the head of a body of troops. Accordingly, he solicited the Picantines for their assistance, who as cordially embraced his motion, and rejected the messengers sent from Carbo, insomuch that a certain Vindius, taking upon him to say that Pompey was come from the schoolroom to put himself at the head of the people, they were so incensed that they fell forthwith upon this Vindius and killed him. From henceforward Pompey, finding a spirit of government upon him, though not above 23 years of age, nor deriving an authority by commission from any man, took the privilege to grant himself full power, and caused a tribunal to be erected in the marketplace of Oxymum, a populous city, expelled 2 other principal men, brothers of the name of Ventidius, who were acting against him in Carbo's interests, commanding them by a public edict to depart the city, and then proceeding to levy soldiers, issuing out commissions and to centurions and other officers according to the form of military discipline, and in this manner he went round all the rest of the cities in the district, so that those of Carbo's faction, flying, and all others cheerfully submitting to his command, in a little time he mustered 3 entire legions, having supplied himself, besides, with all manner of provisions, beasts of burden, carriages, and other necessaries of war, and with this equipage he set forward on his march toward Sulla, not as if he were in haste or desirous of escaping observation, but by small journeys, making several halts upon the road to distress and annoy the enemy, and exerting himself to detach from Carbo's interests every part of Italy that he passed through. 3 commanders of the enemy encountered him at once: Carina, Cloelius, Brutus, and drew up their forces, not all in the front, nor together on any one part, but encamping 3 several armies in a circle about him, they resolved to encompass and overpower him. Pompey was no way alarmed at this, but collecting all his troops into one body, and placing his horse in front of the battle, where he himself was in person, he singled out and bent all his forces against Brutus, and when the Celtic horsemen from the enemy's side rode out to meet him, Pompey himself, encountering hand to hand with the foremost and stoutest among them, killed them with a spear. The rest, seeing this, turned their backs and fled, and breaking the ranks of their own foot, presently caused a general rout, whereupon the commanders fell out among themselves and marched off, some one way, some another, as their fortunes led them, and the towns round about came in and surrendered themselves to Pompey, concluding that the enemy was dispersed for fear. Next after these, Scipio, the consul, came to attack him, and with as little success, for before the armies could join or be within the throw of their javelins, Scipio's soldiers saluted Pompey's and came over to them, while Scipio made his escape by flight. Last of all, Carbo himself sent down several troops of horse against him by the river Orsis, which Pompey assailed with the same courage and success as before, and having routed and put them to flight, he forced them in the pursuit into difficult ground, unpassable for horse, where, seeing no hopes of escape, they yielded themselves with their horses and armor all to his mercy. Sulla was hitherto unacquainted with all these actions, and on the first intelligence he received of his movements, was in great anxiety about him, fearing lest he should be cut off among so many and such experienced commanders of the enemy, and marched therefore with all speed to his aid. Now Pompey, having advice of his approach, sent out orders to his officers to marshal and draw up all his forces in full array, that they might make the finest and noblest appearance before the commander-in-chief, for he expected indeed great honors from him, but met with even greater. For as soon as Sulla saw him thus advancing, his army so well appointed, his men so young and strong, and their spirits so high and hopeful with their successes, he alighted from his horse, and being first, as was his due, saluted by them with the title of Imperator, he returned the salutation upon Pompey in the same term and style of Imperator, which might well cause surprise, as none could have anticipated that he would have imparted to one so young in years, and not yet a senator, Imperator, a title which was the object of contention between him and the Scipios and Marii, and indeed all the rest of his department, was agreeable to this first compliment. Whenever Pompey came into his presence, he paid some sort of respect to him, either